starting, is this on? That we're starting the discussion by looking to the future, because usually when we talk about cybersecurity, we focus on the threats and the risks and the vulnerabilities. But this panel reminds us why we have those threats and those vulnerabilities in the first place. Because our societies are changing at a massive pace and because of the good that these technologies are doing. And we have a chance to discuss how to get it right this time. When the internet was started, when the digital economy started 25 years ago, security wasn't really baked in. Well, now we have a technological revolution with the deployment of AI, and also, since we mentioned connectivity here, 5G, we have a chance to deal with security questions from the beginning and perhaps to get it right. Now, to lead this discussion, we have three fantastic discussants. First of all, we have someone who has already spoken to you, Mr. Antonio Missiroli. What I want to mention about him is that in addition to his NATO role, he has also a long career in the EU behind him. Most recently as director of the EU Institute for Security Studies, and before that in the European Commission. We then have Ms. Despina Spanou, who is responsible not only for cybersecurity, but also for e-government, for trust, for e-health, and for building connected mobility in a connected society, which means that she, in her daily job, has to look at both the upside, the future we're building, and how to keep it safe. And then last, but certainly not least, we also have Stanislas de Maupeou, who, coming from us from Thales, has also a long career behind him in the public sector. And he began his career after leaving the French military in the ANSSI, the French National Cyber Agency, already in 2001. So anyone who tells you that cyber is a new hot topic needs to be reminded it's been around for quite a while. So with this, I'd like to invite our panelists to the stage, please. So Antonio, I understand you've already given us your opening statement, but Despina, please, kick us off. What does your daily job entail, and what keeps you up at night?
Preparing for this conference. So, good morning, everyone. It's very nice to see a lot of colleagues and friends in this room. The interest in the Brussels bubble is very vivid on what is happening in cybersecurity. So, I have a fantastic job, I have to admit. And it is called, I'm responsible for the digital society, trust, and cybersecurity. And as you see, the first component is the digital society. So what we try to do in my department, the European Commission, which is led by 5 incredible and committed teams, what we are trying to do is to ensure that the digital society works for people, and that it works in a way that meets today's digital transformation, but also the basic values on which the internal market is based. So indeed, we deal with smart cities, connected cars as part of this smart living. Actually, I think our panel is called a smart world. So we try to make the smart world happen, also respecting the principles of all other horizontal policies. So how will smart cities serve the future, they fight the impact of climate change? How will smart cities work so that people have better lives? And of course, all the research component on how we will have the right applications for that. We work so that the society benefits from the digital transformation of the public administration. This is our e-government work. But also that our healthcare systems benefit from the digital transformation. And then our main business is to work on the values on which the society will be based. And the 2 most important values are security and privacy. So people forget that we also deal with digital privacy. So this is the 2 components we apply throughout our work in the European Commission. So we are responsible for everything that everybody does to make sure we instill security and privacy at the digital field, but also to give the tools. And this is where the electronic identity work that we do and regulatory frameworks like the eIDAS regulation come into place. So we work both on transforming the society, but most importantly on the values on which it is based, and this is where security and privacy come in.
Stanislas?
I have a fantastic job too, like you. In Thales, I'm in charge of the strategy and the marketing in cybersecurity field and in critical system, meaning we deliver products for government and critical infrastructures, and we deliver services too, meaning security operational centers, risk analysis, or pen test, and so on. And in addition, we have a secure cloud and some data scientists and developers in order to deliver secure apps And clearly, we want to secure the digital transformation of our customers, and AI is clearly part of this digital transformation.
So I want to start off with a general question to all three of you, which is, we have a lot going on when it comes to AI. Basically, every advanced country in the world has put out an AI strategy, as the European Commission has. We're talking both about massive investments in developing AI, but also on how to develop AI and deploy it in an ethical manner. We have quite a few ongoing processes, including at the UN. Are we getting it right? I mean, if you look at the current state of play, are things going in the right direction? Do you see any fundamental problems that need adjustment, anything that needs to be added to the mix? Antonio, if I can start with you.
Well, it's a big question, and my first reaction would be, first of all, we have started a bit late, thinking about the possible consequences of that and how to deal with it. Second, it is going to have a huge impact on international relations, I would say. It will have an impact on probably the balance of power at the global level, and something we perhaps do not realize entirely now, but this discussion that is currently taking place on 5G and China and Huawei is perhaps a first sign of the realization of that. It is something that is going to change our daily lives, the way we conduct business, the way we conduct security. We very often tend to, how could I put it, overestimate the short-term impact of these technological changes and to underestimate their long-term effect. I think in this particular case, there is no risk of underestimating anything. The big risk is not to be able to calculate and factor in all these elements. So I think that we started late, and we will have to focus much more on all this. There are different roles that have to be taken into consideration. NATO, for instance, has a relatively limited role in this particular respect. Artificial intelligence is already used to some extent by the military. I mean, some forms of semi-autonomous systems are already in use. Warships can already automatically detect potential attacks and react to that. So I think that is not a ghost that suddenly is appearing on our screens in this domain. And there are elements in which artificial intelligence can help us improve decision-making, both political and military, help us own our skills, for instance, through exercise, which is core NATO business, and of course, more generally, increase our situational awareness. We can detect a number of things thanks to artificial intelligence. The big challenge for an organization like NATO is the fact that in order to use artificial intelligence for good and effectively, you need a lot of data. And when you have to deal with data, there are a number of political and legal issues that have to be dealt with to start with. We have started working on that, but it is, of course, a huge challenge, and I think it is also very sensitive issues vis-à-vis public opinion, and I think we have to be aware of that.
So you know that in the European Commission we are taking a rather horizontal approach. We are trying to tackle the matter from all its angles, starting from the ethical and going to the technological. But what I'm learning, I'm not a technology expert, but what I'm learning about AI is that sometimes you have to distinguish between what is already there, what is being now deployed, and what can come in the future. And I think you have to treat each of these categories differently, because AI is there, it is being used. So we need to use, for instance, our systems when we talk about cybersecurity, and to bring in the topic also of the panel. We need to make sure that we can deploy artificial intelligence for the right purposes. Law enforcement agencies dealing with cybersecurity can make immense progress if they use correct AI, and some of them do. And this is how they manage to discover a lot of issues and to fight a lot of issues. And if we're going to use AI systems, we also need to make sure that we protect those AI systems. So I think that now with the NIS directive coming in and all agencies putting in place and all operators of critical infrastructure putting in place security measures, they need to protect, if they're deploying such systems, they need to protect them equally so that they do not become, in fact, instruments for attacking further. Because, of course, AI can be used the other way. It can be used for devastating cyber attacks. So we also have to protect, when we build AI, we have to build also its security components for itself, for its own protection. And then, of course, what we are doing in the European Commission is making sure that when it comes to the future, so research and innovation, but also the investment we will have to do through the Digital Europe program that my colleague mentioned extensively earlier, we invest because it's not going to go away. So we need to invest in options and in how to use it. I believe that the legal instruments we are putting in place will help in this respect. For instance, the certification framework will generate schemes with standards that will certainly need to consider artificial intelligence components. And also, if we manage to build in time the competence center and the network of competence centers in Europe, I believe this will be a substantive part of their work. So we're building the blocks. We already have a lot of research done in Europe, but we also need to have actions for what exists already.
At Thales, we don't start late. I hope so. But clearly, we are already using artificial intelligence processes and algorithmic for safety and security. But keep in mind that in cybersecurity field, the question is not if or when we will use artificial intelligence in security operational center, but how. The key point is how. And keep in mind, 2 points, according to a survey, 75% of chief information security officers see the artificial intelligence as a revolution to address big challenges in cybersecurity field. But in the same time, according to Gartner, 80% of the AI project failed, meaning the how issue is absolutely key. It's not only a question of technology, it's a question of people, it's a question of skills, and obviously a question of data. I think that one of the key success factors is a good choice of data.
So if we look at how AI is being rolled out right now, do you see in the next 5 to 10 years that it's more of an upside or a downside for security? In 2016, DARPA held an AI Grand Challenge where at the time AI didn't beat the best cybersecurity teams, but it was actually able to beat the average cybersecurity team in penetrating into systems and carrying out red team attacks. Now, the winner of the authors of the winning AI said they thought that was an advantage for the defense because it would let people test their systems before they put them out in the wild and basically build impenetrable systems. But there's a caveat there, which is it actually requires the people deploying their systems to use these tools, because at the same time, we can imagine that the bad guys will be using those advanced AI tools to go and penetrate those systems. So do you think that we're able to, Despina and Stanislas talked about using AI to enhance security. Do you think that in the next 5 to 10 years, it will actually have that effect of enhancing security, or that we'll see increasing numbers of risks and vulnerabilities of attacks against AI systems?
I don't know, but what it shows that today, attackers don't need AI to penetrate the system. Based on the level of security of a lot of systems, it's not, they don't need to use artificial intelligence and all of kind of big data and so on. It's so simple based on password or something like that. So keep in mind that it's important for the future to prepare our system with artificial intelligence, obviously, and to defend the system. But it's not enough. We need to implement best practices and back to the basic. Okay, artificial intelligence is very important, clearly, but before to imagine the attacker with artificial intelligence capabilities, we need to secure our system with very basic rules. It's not exactly your question, but keep in mind that it's very important to think that. So first of all, implement the best and the best practices in our systems before to think about the capability of the attackers with artificial intelligence. But obviously, in the future, and maybe right now, in terms, for example, in terms of threat intelligence, or in terms of capability to assess a system, in terms of vulnerability of new way of attacks, obviously, artificial intelligence will be a new opportunity for the attackers.
Yes, indeed. I cannot definitely judge better than that. What I would say is that we will need to watch carefully the first applications in our digital society where AI will be deployed and where it could be used. The very typical example I've been hearing in my job is connected cars. That connected cars, for both reasons. First, because every time we talk about artificial intelligence, there is the inherent question, how will that be deployed in connected cars that will be making decisions for the driver, for the people who are in it, etc. And then on the side of the security, how will connected cars be used to, in fact, deploy massive attacks by interfering with their systems. But this is a technology that is coming. There is now a large demonstration testing taking place in Europe, and I think we need to take advantage of these experiments to test our systems. So this is one side where we can work on actual applications that are now being tested. And this is an enormous opportunity when it comes to connected cars. We have large corridors in Europe where we actually have demonstrations of this technology, so we must test it. And secondly, I fully concur. We now have a system and a legal system in Europe for everyone who has an important role in society, so those operators of essential services, but also government agencies, to meet security requirements. So when they build these security requirements, which they must, it is the NIS Directorate requirement, they have to also make sure they look at these technologies and how they can be used and protect their systems, but also use them to protect their system. So for that, we need a lot of information sharing. We need those that understand better and who have the tools to share with those that don't, because in the internal market, you cannot have two speeds. And this is where I think the mechanisms of the legal system of the European Union can be very, very important. If you look at the incident reporting requirements that come with the NIS directive, the moment you have attacks linked with AI systems, or even AI systems being attacked, if this information is shared, everybody will learn and it will help us build our defense.
Well, when cyber started, we mostly looked only to the bright side of that. It was seen as an enabling industrial revolution to some extent. And then we started realizing the dark side of cyber. On AI, perhaps we are starting the other way around. All this emphasis on killer robots, and I don't know if you read this article by Henry Kissinger that was published a few months ago, How Enlightenment Ends. And it's about the fact that machines are going to substitute not our muscles, but our brains. And of course, the aging wise man of the West was highlighting his concerns about that. I think perhaps the fact that now we are starting from the dark side of that. However, it is not entirely fair, because I think we have to keep a strong attention on the potential and the opportunities that it raises, could also help us prepare ourselves to better deal with that. And these predictions very often prove untrue, but they prove untrue because we react to these predictions. And I think human action is essential in this particular domain. I think the general concern everybody has, especially in the security field, is that in what we call the Western world, we are all sharing the same values and the same concerns, but other players elsewhere may not be driven by the same values and concerns. And therefore, we may be confronted with a situation in which we play at a disadvantage, with a handicap in that particular domain.
I'm going to want to come back to that question, but first, there's something that's been irking me as a former legislator and regulator, which is you've listed, all of you, measures that we can take to make our systems more secure. And Antonio, you had a somewhat optimistic take that maybe we're thinking realistically about the threats this time around. But I mean, the history of not just cybersecurity, but many other policy areas around safety, around security, shows that yes, you will have some companies that internalize these risks and that try and build business models around building secure systems, but never is everyone going to be incentivized to think about security in a structured way without some kind of, whether that's regulation, insurance, or other market incentive to get them to properly internalize those risks. If I'm a programmer trying to build the next big startup using AI, frankly, my competitive advantage is going to come from moving faster, from not taking the time to test everything. How do we actually get the massive innovators, both in Europe but elsewhere, to think realistically about these risks and to internalize them without ruining their innovation and their business models? And I suppose all three of you have different vantage points on this. I mean, Stanislas, you have to sell security-related software and hardware for good amounts of money. I mean, Thales is not cheap, right? No, but you have to make a value proposition, but you have to get your customers to really appreciate that value proposition. Despina, you of course have, as Carl told us, been on a rip-roaring regulatory journey over the last 2 years with a whole bunch of new regulation. And Antonio, I think you have the hardest job of all, which is you have to get 29 often recalcitrant allies with, okay, increasing now thanks to apparently Donald Trump defense budgets, but nevertheless very tight defense budgets, to spend not just on tanks, but also on cybersecurity. How do you guys do it?
Well, first of all, we are about to become 30. I don't know whether that is going to make things easier or not, but with North Macedonia joining the alliance, I think we'll reach a round number, 30 at 70. That is the slogan we are promoting. Let me put it this way. Promoting spending on cyber defense is much easier than promoting spending on conventional defense vis-à-vis public opinion. It is a public good that having better protection and better defense in that field is good for business, is good for society, is good for security. I mentioned earlier on in my introductory remarks the Cyber Defense Pledge. One of the sources of evidence of that exercise is that virtually everybody has increased spending at the national level on that. And everybody is confronted with the same dilemma. It is a national prerogative, it is a national responsibility, at the same time nobody can act alone. And I think this dynamics is proving very effective in encouraging people to reach out to partners, both within multilateral frameworks and bilaterally or plurilaterally, so to speak. And there is an acute awareness that there is a need to cooperate together. And I think also in this particular field, I think that is inevitably what is going to happen. And national doctrines are evolving very, very fast. I mean, you were saying what is interesting in your job. I think what is interesting in my job in particular is the fact that as compared to other domains of traditional defense and security, this is one in which everybody is moving very fast. And therefore there are no deeply rooted, consolidated national doctrines that confront each other at the NATO table, but everybody is moving very, very fast and evolving. And I think it is intellectually fascinating, politically intriguing, and I think that is probably the future. I mean, everybody has to be aware that in this globalized environment, that is the way ahead.
Stanislas?
Yes, maybe first of all, it's not so easy to sell security. Without regulations and without attacks, the human nature, that is not so easy to sell security. It's a cost. It's viewed as a cost, first of all. So we need regulations. We need roadmaps. It's very important for our customers and for our investment to have such regulations and roadmaps. Second point. Today, we are working for critical infrastructures, for system mission criticals, meaning we need accreditations, we need qualification, certification. And maybe it's the most important point regarding, as far as I understand on this topic. Today, we are not able to certify EI. And we need certification to operate the system in critical environments. So, meaning that in detection system based on rules, meaning intrusion detection system based on signatures, or CM to detect and to correlate some event, we can ensure compliance and qualification. We can do that. With EI, I don't know how to do that. How to decide and how to understand why there is an alert coming from EI. I don't know, because it's intelligence, artificial intelligence. So, meaning we need to build together with the regulators, with the data scientists, with the industry, to build a framework in order to be able to qualify system based on artificial intelligence. I mean in cybersecurity field. It could be, there is another point in safety domain, but clearly this point is absolutely mandatory to deploy in operations artificial intelligence in cybersecurity field?
It's very interesting for me to hear recently so much call for regulation in this area. It's rare. So, and last week I was in Munich. In fact, we were there together, and we heard the same call from the stakeholders. And I think it's a very genuine call. I have worked for many years in my career in the Commission in the area of safety, which is one of the success stories of the internal market, because it's fully regulated, the same everywhere, and we don't have to worry about it, and our citizens are actually enjoying a society where safety is a given. When it comes to security, we are not at the same level. There has always been the distinguishing line between what belongs fully to the jurisdiction of member states to do because it is linked to national security, but we have now a full body of actions going towards the internal market aspects, and I think that we are on the right track. But when it comes to AI, I hear more and more the call about how we're going to ensure where the liabilities, where the legal framework goes, and I think we are trying to work in that direction in the Commission. But there is also a lot of other things we can do. You mentioned certification. I think I referred to it earlier. I think it has to become part and parcel of our work on certification and security, which is still a voluntary framework, but we should go now to the most fundamental digital applications of life. We already start working on European schemes for that purpose, for high levels of assurance, and artificial intelligence has to be a component. So there we fully agree. Luukas, you asked how do we make everybody work together without hindering innovation. It's impossible for one to make it alone. This is where we propose the creation of this community in our proposal on the Competence Center. And you asked me what keeps me awake at night. It is this proposal, because we consider very urgent to create this community. This is the community from the regulation, the proposal that Karl Boer mentioned earlier, for the creation of a network of competence centers. But what people forget is that we are proposing to even make a community, so to bring private sector, academia, and the public sector together to work on projects, to work on investments, to advise us where procurement is necessary, how this procurement should be done, if it needs to take a strategic approach. This is a fundamental proposal for changing security. And it would also show us where we need regulation, because it is very difficult to identify now where regulation is needed, how we will do it, other than liability, which will also be very tricky, but we must start working on it. There are also other aspects where this regulation will be needed, and we need to identify that. So we need everybody to work together. This is where we see the urgency of this proposal and the creation of a European Center of Competence that will pull all this expertise and all this knowledge together and make proposals. Because we also have one more problem. We don't have enough people who can do that, either in Europe or anywhere else, because of the skills problem that we are facing. So this is why we believe enormously in this joint approach that will bring together also those that know from the private sector, the few ones that know still in the public sector that have not been recruited by the private sector, because this is the reality of it all, so that we tackle the matter.
I have one more question for the panel, but I want you to start getting your questions ready. We've heard a bit of a consensus here that some amount of regulation and legal framework is necessary. If there are any deregulationists here, it's a good chance to challenge this consensus. But before we get to that, Antonio, you started talking a bit about common values and opened up this question of, okay, we're going to cooperate on security, on certification standards. Who do we cooperate with? Munich has gone through the discussion a few times. The elephant in the room in Munich was Huawei, and the question of, in a world where we can't yet perfectly certify AI, where there has to be an amount of implicit trust in AI and the 5G network that we're building, there might be some differentials in who we trust in terms of which suppliers, which source countries. Now, you've had to look at different groupings of, near 30 countries, the EU, NATO. How do you look at this trust question? And what is the right focus for focusing the trust around? Do you build that on the EU? Do you go for, NATO is not just a military but also a strategic alliance? Do you bring all the democracies in, or are there other criteria that you can use? I'd like to start with you, but I have the same question also for Despina and for Stanislas.
Well, I cannot speak for the EU, of course. I can only speak for NATO, and what I see in NATO is that cooperation and collaboration exist. They exist certainly at the bilateral level. There are a group of nations that cooperate very closely with one another. There are some nations that are better capabilities in this field that also help other nations that are less well equipped to develop their own skills in this domain, and is perfectly normal among allies inside NATO. And I see an increasing effort to use also NATO as a forum for having certain discussions on attribution, on increasing capabilities that normally take place at a different level. So there is an increased awareness that on the one hand, everybody has to do his homework in this field. At the same time, that is not enough. And I see a drive in that direction. I think one of the challenges we are confronted with in this domain, and I think not just the public musketeer, but also the private musketeer, is that unveiling or showing vulnerabilities, which is a basis for building trust and cooperating with one another, is difficult. On the public side, especially intelligence agencies and the military tend to be very jealous of what they know, for better and for worse, and we are very often confronted with a highly classified environment in this field. And I'm tempted to say, similarly on the private side, the risk of reputational implications is very strong. And therefore, that is the kind of trust that has to be built on a sort of balance of mutual concession in that field, whereby perhaps more informally than formally, you start sharing information about what is happening out there. We cannot know what is happening out there in the web as well as those who operate the web. I mean, think of cloud computing. Who knows what is happening in the cloud? Those who own and operate the cloud. And therefore, it is absolutely essential to be able to build trust with them. At the same time, that requires perhaps on the public side a degree of openness about the risk and vulnerabilities we are all confronted with. And I think this is a process that has started, and there is a sort of gradual building up of trust in this field that is based on good cases, best practice in this domain. We all know that the same doesn't happen with other partners and interlocutors worldwide. I suppose that events, to some extent, could help shape a different attitude if also some of those who may want to do us harm are going to be hit. And then, of course, perhaps a realization that perhaps not, how could I put it, limiting the weapons. That is not something that can happen easily in this field. It is mostly about software, and you cannot verify the presence of software in that particular set. But limiting the targets of these activities could be something that the international community, at some stage, perhaps not now, will be able to achieve.
I want to push you on NATO a little bit. Your largest ally has called on European countries, very concretely on Huawei, not to, shall we say, overuse their equipment. But this is probably not the first type of this discussion that we're going to, the last type of this discussion we're going to have in coming decades. Is NATO a good format for holding these sensitive discussions with classified information that requires you in sort of isolated rooms where everyone's given up their telephones to discuss these things? Or do you think those discussions between allies will happen elsewhere?
Well, NATO is not a regulatory body in that respect. It's more the business of the European Union to do these things, and the European doesn't cover the whole of the NATO alliance in this particular respect. I think it's good to have this kind of conversation. It's good to have it not limited to Huawei, but also or to 5G as such, but to the whole supply chain issue that is wider than 5G. And I think that considerations of security have to be part of that. My understanding is that there are alternatives to Huawei in this particular domain. At the same time, we don't want to put in danger the kind of general approach we have to regulation and markets just because of this kind of concern. So finding a balance between the security considerations and the willingness to keep a degree of openness of our markets and procurement procedures is going to be essential, but that is more EU business, not NATO's.
Despina, that everyone's looking at you right now.
About what?
About your
I
business.
wonder about my business. Well, at the same time, it's not our business to go into matters of national security. So this is definitely a business we stay out of. So sometimes on this topic, you have much more interesting discussions that we are not privy to. But our job is, again, for the internal market. And there, what I have to say is that my own experience in the last 2 years in this job is that there is an increasing desire on behalf of the member states to work together and to cooperate on matters of cybersecurity. And this was not always the case, as I'm told by my colleagues who have been in this area for much longer, and I see you join these voices. And I think that this is part, first of all, of the political will to have a European security area. So this is the larger picture. But also the realization that we are so interconnected in Europe, the internal market is dependent on connectivity, we have a digital single market, and security needs to be part of it. The mechanisms we have put in place are being used very well by the member states, some to a larger, some to a lesser extent. For instance, the cooperation group, which is about policy matters, and that was created by the NIS directive, started already working even before the directive entered into force, created work streams, generated fundamental work for the implementation of the NIS directive. It shows you that member states really want to have the same approach. So even though we started with a directive, it is also becoming like a regulation because everybody works together. And I would not hesitate in seeing in the future this cooperation group tackling also these fundamental questions. What do we do about certain market-related security issues, and how do we tackle them? And this could happen any day now, easily, because it's a very mature group in which member states discuss anything from the security of elections and produce work that becomes European recommendations, for instance, to how do you define an operator of essential services and security requirements, etc. The second very important cooperation system we have is the network of the emergency response teams. Now, this is not yet to the same level of maturity, I would say, as it still has a kind of various speed type of approach, but it is coming together, and that is very helpful in case one day we are faced with an incident, a crisis, a major vulnerability that hits many member states, and that can come from the market, that can come from any issue. And I think we need to have this network activate itself so that we are also alarmed on actual incidents and we learn from them. And then, of course, you have, as I mentioned, what can come in the future, people working together and identifying solutions for these issues. Because, yes, maybe now everybody's focusing on one market operator and certain products, but this is a market where you will have products that are unique. So what you have to make sure is that you have a set of requirements, and maybe that will be our job as regulator if we are mandated by the member states to do that. And if there is a fact base for that, to produce baseline requirements for cybersecurity across the board. It is very interesting that even for simple products, connected products, if we talk about the Internet of Things, we don't have a baseline requirement for their security in Europe. It's not like product safety where you have a horizontal legislation saying anything that circulates in the internal market must be safe. So I think we're getting there, and that should help with individual problems of this kind. And of course, you can also add safeguards when it comes to higher levels of assurance necessary for certain systems. But again, you can have an agreed set of safeguards by the member states that they will apply in the internal market.
Stanislas, you have a more global view on this.
We are far, with your question related to Huawei, we are far from EI, but
Connectivity is entitled to.
yeah, yes, sure. As I explained before, our job is to secure digital transformation, and digital transformations needs trust, and trust needs cybersecurity. It's all. I think it's very important to keep in mind that there is no digital transformation without cybersecurity. It doesn't make sense. And as far as I know on this job, the unique way to define and to prove the trust is evaluation. So, and according to me, the European Directive Network Information Security is part of this framework, able to define a certification body in order to test, to evaluate products and maybe system. That's my first point. To ensure, to guarantee trust and maybe sovereignty, we need to evaluate the product. It's very basic. The second point is I would like to share with you is that in France, we define la loi de programmation militaire. It's a framework very similar with the NIS directive. It's a framework, and what is very interesting in this framework, we evaluate products and people, products and company. It's not only an evaluation dedicated to products, based on common criteria with a different level of security and safety. But the main goal of this framework is to define a trusted ecosystem. And keep in mind, think ecosystem. Think ecosystem. It's not an issue, just a matter of products. It's a matter of system, based on interconnection, based on the cloud, based on all what we have to do right now in the framework of the digital transformation. So think ecosystem, and we need to be able, obviously, to certify a product, but to think at the system level with the different interconnections, with the supply chains, with the people, and so on. So, and I think that the unique rational response reading your question for Huawei is to think trust, ecosystem, and certification body.
Quick response from Despina, and then we take questions.
I want to just add something. I'm very grateful for what you said, that for a digital society you need trust, and to have trust you need cybersecurity. We're forgetting something, and we've been talking for half an hour about how to make connectivity work for a better world. I think this is the title of the session. And we forget privacy. And artificial intelligence is also relevant in this respect. And we have to make sure we also use it. Let's go a little bit behind, beyond just the industrial application, and look also the society and the people. So we have to make sure that we also use the benefits of the technology for privacy. Because, yes, you cannot have a digital society without security, but you also need privacy. These are the two fundamental components and basic values for how we operate in the internal market. And we should not forget it in the discussion of AI, because, again, you can use AI to implement privacy rules. And I think the smart, and we are already having research projects from our current program in the European Union that try to demonstrate how to use AI to implement the GDPR and privacy rules. But we must also protect our systems so that AI is not used to interfere with privacy and to collect data without the relevant rules respect.
Great. So I'd like to take 3 questions in the first round. We'll group them together. Gentleman Luukas over there, and then we'll see who else has a question. For here, then. And please introduce yourself briefly.
Thank you, Luukas. Good morning, everyone. I'm Luukas Pimper. I'm Czech Cyber Attaché here in Brussels, both for EU and NATO. I'm very grateful for all the comments. I can only subscribe to what was mentioned. I particularly appreciate the mention of supply chain security and the trusted ecosystem creation. That's definitely something we're looking at, and we're ready to contribute. However, I would like to put attention also on let's say the higher level above it when we're speaking about the AI and let's say and assuring the security and safe application of that. Shouldn't we also being laced to the also ongoing discussion about the AI ethics, etc. Do you see a room for something like a Tallinn manual for AI, or defining basically the application of the let's say international rules and all the say human rights based rules also in this AI environment, or do you think it's too late? Thanks.
Okay, gentleman here.
Good morning. My name is Marcin Terlik. I'm from Onet portal. I'd like to ask you if you see it as a problem that like the leading and the biggest tech companies with the biggest advantage in the artificial intelligence revolution are based outside of EU, and that actually we transfer a lot of our data and giving them the best possibilities to develop the new technology to United States. Thank you.
Okay, well, we've got 2 tough questions. I don't know who wants to take them first. Stanislas?
Just regarding your question and the first question, totally agree with you. And Thales promote something like ethical AI. So at this stage, I would like to say it's a concept, but we again It's similar with the Call of Paris regarding the internet. We need to cooperate. We have no choice. It's a worldwide issue for the citizen, for our value, and I think that we need to be very ambitious on this domain before because it could be too late in a few years. So it's right now. You need to define such framework. Ethical AI is just at this stage it's an idea, but in Thales it's clearly a stopover in this domain.
You're a French company. Are you bothered by all the big American platforms with their AIs?
No comment.
No comment. Oh.
I can answer this question because we're often faced with this question. I think that the investment we propose, both in terms of research and innovation, but also in terms of infrastructure for the next financial framework in the Commission, shows that we want to excel in Europe. And it may be true that a lot of the AI technology comes from the US. What matters is that when it comes to the EU, it follows the EU rules and guidelines and what the EU will decide to do with AI. This is what matters in our market. At the same time, AI is an opportunity, and we therefore need to give an opportunity to our startups, to our SMEs, and to our European companies to develop this technology, and this is why we have proposed what we've proposed for the next European budget. So I don't find the answer to this question very difficult. I find more difficult the first question, because again there I don't know if you can make specific rules. What we have started in the EU I think is quite unique, that we have member states and experts working together. We created 2 groups. They are talking to each other. We are trying to have a common approach. The development of guidelines on ethics, I think, shows where Europe is leading with that. We also have an action plan, so I cannot say that we lag behind. We take the time that is necessary to work in a Europe of many member states. So we always have this inclusive process. But I think we are going for an approach that tries to be inclusive and that touches upon a horizontal approach on AI that can be applied anywhere, because AI will be everywhere. So this is also the issue. You cannot just have one manual only for AI. You have to look at all the possible applications and ensure it is uptaken.
Well, 2 points. One is on the issue of whether we are at risk of giving unfair advantage to American companies. What about the Chinese? I mean, Huawei, Tencent are giants in this field, probably already comparable with Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft, and they already have a basis of data to work on that is not comparable to the West's. So I think that, just to put things in perspective, that is what I said when I think that AI is probably changing the balance of power and of powers worldwide in the years to come, and I think we have to be aware of all that. In general, the second point is regulating new technologies at the multilateral level takes time. Normally, before a technology achieves a certain level of regulation through conventions or regimes, it takes decades. It is a technology that has to mature before being part of a conversation at the multilateral level. I think historically the only exceptions are the Outer Space Treaty that was signed in the late 60s at the beginning of the space age. And there is another exception in the 1990s that was a protocol on the prohibition of blinding lasers that was signed in the 1990s, in the golden age of multilateralism after the end of the Cold War. But otherwise, it is normally very, very difficult and very slow as a process. And probably all the more so in an international environment in which there is very little multilateral cooperation globally. I mean, the UN and multilateralism are in a difficult state right now, and in which some powers think that they can reap extra benefits by not regulating these technologies. And therefore, this is the challenge we are confronted with. NATO is not a norm-setting institution. Normally, regulation and norms are set by countries, individual nations, and multilateral bodies, so we are not in that business. But of course, we try and act in full compliance with international law, in particular international humanitarian law. My impression, as I said earlier on, is that events, including potentially catastrophic events that could hit a country or a community, could also lead to better regulation in this field, but it's not something that we would wish for at this stage in order to have a better result at the end of the day.
Well, my only 2 cents there, as long as we keep on calling it the Tallinn Manual, it's a great idea. I'm Estonian. I think that, Antonio, you finished us off perfectly, because what you've laid clear is that while we have this broad consensus on the need to work together between public and private sector, we have similar sets of concepts within Europe and to some extent across the Atlantic. Those aren't necessarily global. And so the road ahead of us will be difficult. Hopefully we'll move faster than we have on the previous generation of cybersecurity challenges, but I don't think any policymaker is going to be put out of business in the near future. So with that, I want you to give this excellent panel a warm round of applause and thank you for your attention.